All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Walker, the Walden Woods Project's Education Director. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our presentation with Restore's Michael Kellett. The Walden Woods Project is a nonprofit based out of Lincoln, Massachusetts. We preserve the land, literature, and legacy of Henry David Thoreau to foster an ethic of environmental stewardship and social responsibility. Our organization was founded in 1990 by recording artist Don Henley, and this past April, we celebrated 34 years. This event is also sponsored by Restore the North Woods. Restore is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992 by veteran conservationists and grassroots activists. The mission of Restore the North Woods is to create new national parks, save natural forests, and protect endangered wildlife. This is a Zoom webinar, so you are only able to see the host and the panelists. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen if you're having tech difficulties, and we'll do our best to help out. And you can also use the chat to correspond with each other. If you would like closed captioning, you can click the live transcript or a caption button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And there will be an audience Q&A after Michael's presentation tonight. So please enter any questions throughout in the Q&A box and we will address them later. And I'll now turn it over to Michael Kellett, Executive Director of Restore the North Woods. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here, and thanks for coming on board and listening. I'm going to do a presentation on new national parks, the efforts that we've been working on. And I'm going to try not to be too long-winded, so there's time for questions and comments. So I'm going to go ahead and hopefully succeed in sharing here. There it is. Okay. So I'm going to talk about new national parks, as you can guess from the title. And the reason this is relevant is, among other things, because as everyone I think listening today knows, we're facing a planetary emergency. We're dealing with large-scale climate change issues. We're dealing with the loss of biodiversity and habitats, and lots of public health ramifications from both of these things. And they're all happening at the same time. And a primary cause for all these problems is the degradation of wild nature by humans. And this has been happening for a long time, of course, but it's been accelerating, and the more loss we have, the bigger the problem becomes. In New England, where I live, this was one of the first places, probably the first place in the United States, where large-scale changes, human changes in natural systems happened. And not that long ago, before 1600, most of New England was covered with old-growth forests with big old trees in a lot of places, and deep, wet, moist forests. And in a short time, by the mid-1800s, almost all the forests had been mowed down and turned into fields and farms and towns. One of the people who observed all of this and was very far-sighted in his observations was Henry David Thoreau. And it's interesting, his writing, he noted all the species of wildlife that had disappeared by the time he lived. He noted that cutting down forests is not good for birds, and that they disappeared when you cut the forest down. And I really found it very insightful that even then, he's talking about the rising generation in the town of Concord don't know basically what a real oak or pine is, basically because all the big old growth had been cut down. So they just had these spindly young trees, which is pretty much the situation in much of New England and the US today, because we keep going over and over and over and cutting these forests down. What's really different about him, though, is that he actually had a vision of what maybe we could do about it. So before any national parks existed, he talked about why shouldn't we have national preserves for our inspiration and true recreation or recreation, as he termed it. And this was after he had visited the Maine woods. And he wrote this, he wrote in his journal, and then he wrote an article for Atlantic Monthly in 1858. And in 1859, also after um, thinking more about this, he thought, well, it shouldn't, nature shouldn't be relegated to far off places like the Maine woods. We are, every town, each town should have a park. And this is not just a manicured park. These would be parks where you don't cut down any trees. And again, he was thinking about instruction and recreation, but he was thinking on a local level. So less than 2 decades later, Yellowstone was created as the world's first national park. And it had a sort of a similar goal, the benefit and enjoyment of the people. And interestingly, at national parks, the way they were set up, it's similar to what Thoreau's idea was of wildlands in the Maine woods and so forth. So all this kind of stuff, human exploitation of resources in the environment, are not allowed in national parks. And they haven't been, with a few exceptions over the years. They made a few mistakes in the early days, but they pretty much have stuck with this model. Whereas all the things you're seeing here are allowed in national forests, on Bureau of Land Management lands, on state forests, on state other kinds of state lands in out west. There they have state, more prairie kind of grasslands. This kind of stuff is allowed, but not in national parks. And it makes a big difference. So 150 years later, after Yellowstone was created, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's considered one of the few remaining intact large ecosystems in the northern temperate zone of Earth. And if you look at this map, the dark colored blobs are national parks, so Yellowstone, and then below it is Grand Teton National Park. The light green, though, are other public federal lands, mainly national forest lands. And some of that is wilderness, which is also protected similar to a national park, but most of that is not protected from all those things I just showed you that are degrading the ecosystem. So expanding national parks can help to stabilize the climate, can help to preserve biodiversity, and to promote public health and well-being. So for climate, national parks, of course, they protect forests and grasslands and other things that can store carbon. And they also naturally regulate the climate and the temperature and extremes. They also are resilient to climate change. So natural ecosystems are able to adjust to changes in the climate because they've developed that way over millions of years. National parks for biodiversity, when you protect these big areas, you're also protecting ecosystems, intact ecosystems, and you're protecting the wildlife that need those ecosystems. You can also restore degraded habitats in national parks. People think of Yellowstone, for example, which was never logged or whatever, but for example, Great Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina and Tennessee, that was almost completely cut over at one time. And when the park was designated, a lot of it was basically almost barren, growing back forest. And today, if you go there, you'd never know. It's a beautiful, lush forest land. And it's one of the most biodiverse places in the United States and on the planet, really. And also, when you create big national parks, you have these core areas of habitat that allow uh, um, wildlife to migrate, especially north and south, as you have changes in the climate. So if you have little tiny blobs of protected area, the wildlife have no place to go if they're surrounded with development and exploitation. And of course, national parks are for people, and that was the original reason why they designated the early parks. It wasn't that they didn't want to protect nature, but it was protecting nature for humans to enjoy, and that's a great thing. And actually, we now know that there's lots of science that shows that nature is good for our health. It's good for our mental health, for our physical health. So just having humans being able to go out in beautiful wild places is good for us. And of course, those wild places protect clean water, clean air, um, watersheds, and so forth. And of course, they help us because they provide, they boost our local economies, make places more livable. And they also are good places to teach people how important nature is, and that helps to create public support for protecting more areas. So there's an international goal for all these reasons. There's an international goal to expand protected areas to 30% of the planet by 2030. And it's nicknamed 30 by 30. And there's also support for 50% of the planet by 2050, which is called half Earth. And I won't go into all the detail here, but the point is that there's been a lot of research on what it means to be protected. And national parks are in also wilderness areas, which are similar in a lot of ways, that can be designated on federal lands. And also some state parks and preserves like Adirondack Park or Baxter Park in Maine, or those areas also fit into the highest protection categories. However, only about 18% of the Earth is protected, is significantly protected for the 30 by 30 goal. So here we're getting close to 2030, and we're only at 18%. In the US, we're even further behind. It's now, it's a little more than 12%. Is protected as national parks, wilderness, state, well-protected state parks, et cetera. So we've got a long way to go in the US. And unfortunately, there's no plan that's going to get us there right now. There's no national plan. There's the interest and there's the support from the Biden administration, but it hasn't resolved into in the level of action we need. So, and part of the problem is that even the amount that is protected is mostly out west and in Alaska. So many of the ecosystems in the United States have little or no protection at all. So it's not just the amount, but it's also, we're not covering all the different ecoregions and ecosystems to even basically to protect them from all these the coming emergency. So we're proposing, we're saying Thoreau had the right idea. Each state should have a national park. And we've proposed 100 new national parks, Restore the North Woods. We've spent years consulting with other groups and doing research and looking at areas that have been proposed in the past and coming up with some new areas. And this is all potential. These are not areas that are going to become national parks tomorrow, but we're saying, let's take a look at these areas and other areas as well, and think about them being designated as national parks. There are two ways to do that. One is through congressional legislation. Congress passes laws in the House and the Senate, and then the president has to sign the law. And that's also the case with wilderness areas. Most wilderness areas are in national parks, so it's an extra layer of preservation. Also, the president can proclaim national monuments, which can become national park system areas, which are similar to national parks. And that's under the Antiquities Act. And people have probably heard about a few of those areas in the last, President Biden and also President Obama designated a lot of them. Those can be designated to be managed by the National Park Service. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but the point is we took a look at what criteria should we have to create new national parks. The National Park Service has these old criteria that the Congress set up years ago. This was before climate change was even acknowledged. That none of the crises we're dealing with now were serious issues. And they sort of were saying, oh, well, we don't want too many parks. We don't want just a few crown jewels. And we don't want, for example, we have Mount Rainier. That's a Cascade volcanic mountain. So we don't need any more Cascade volcanoes like Mount Hood or Mount Adams or Mount Shasta. And that's a ridiculously outdated approach. That was in the days when they thought, oh, there's plenty of forest out there. We don't have to preserve everything. There's plenty out there. So what we're saying is let's take a look at areas that are important for climate, important for biodiversity, important for people, especially having parks close to people. Whereas, as you saw that map, the eastern US and the middle of the US have very few national parks. So millions and millions of people have no national park, no large national park. They might have a little historic area, but they don't have a large national park nearby. And that makes no sense. We need to, and we found areas that really could fully qualify as national parks that are near big cities. And we also have to look at priorities. A lot of the areas on our list are really threatened. They're seriously threatened with logging, mining, livestock grazing, development, pipelines, you name it. And we need to act fast on all of this. So here's several examples, just to give a couple samples across the country. The Range of Light, which is proposed as a national monument, but it could be a national park. This is an area that stretches from Yosemite National Park to Sequoia National Park. In the spine of the Sierra Nevada, there are some wilderness areas along there, but a lot of it is not protected. So there's logging, burning, supposedly for fire, which is not scientifically valid. Livestock grazing, ATVs, other stuff. Right now, this area is not well protected. This fully deserves to be a national park. North Cascades National Park in Washington, from the day it was created, activists have been trying to expand it because it's way too small. There are lots of national forests surrounding it, none of which are adequately protected from logging, burning, mining, etc. And those could be added to the national park. Glen Canyon in Utah, which is a national recreation area, you may have heard about what's going on there. The Colorado River, the flow of the Colorado River, which goes through Glen Canyon, has declined significantly from past years, and it's not going to go back. It's not going to be what it was. There's not enough water to fill these big reservoirs. Lake Mead and then Lake Powell is in Glen Canyon. And there's a dam, Glen Canyon Dam, that holds it back. So this reservoir is going down, down, down. It's not going to be full again. And what's happening is all these side canyons are restoring themselves. And it's becoming this incredibly diverse place. It's beautiful. People can now uh, raft and boat down the flowing river. So it's basically a totally new area. And so uh, there are organizations and activists who want to drain Lake Powell, bypass this dam, this worthless Glen Canyon Dam, and create it, upgrade it to a new national park. And around this area are a bunch of Bureau of Land Management lands. And then any of you know about Bureau of Land Management, these lands are not well protected from a lot of things: livestock grazing, motorized use, mining, drilling. So you could even expand the park, expand it to a bigger national park. Uh, but the East also and Midwest have amazing areas too. The Shawnee National Forest in Illinois, um, most people think of Illinois as just flat cornfields, but Southern Illinois is really actually very hilly and rocky and diverse and beautiful. And there are forests there that are very lush and biodiverse, and they're growing back after being cut in the past. Unfortunately, the U.S. Forest Service, which manages the national forest, is logging and burning and doing all kinds of destructive stuff. But this area ought to be a national park. This is within reach of St. Louis and Chicago and Memphis and many other mid places with lots of people who really deserve to have a national park. And the Maine woods, of course, to go back to Thoreau, um, this is what he was talking about when he was talking about national preserves. And this is the biggest undeveloped expanse of forest in the eastern United States, east of the Rockies. And you can see the map in the middle. This is our proposed Maine Woods National Park, 3.2 million acres, which we Restore the North Woods proposed back in the 90s. And we've been working on it and working, and the need is greater and greater and greater as more and more of this area is sold to venture capitalists. Donald Trump Jr. just bought land for hunting, for a little hunting camp of his own, and so forth. And we're not saying people don't have the right to buy land, but we need some big chunks of this before it's gone. We need to protect them. And there's a national monument, Katahdin Woods and Waters, that was created by President Obama within this bigger green area that's on that map, but it's not nearly big enough. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, but we need much more protection. So we want to build on that monument and protect the big Maine woods that's still out there. So there are a number of questions that come to people's minds. Can we afford this? Isn't this going to cost a lot of money? The reality is that 91% of the areas we're proposing as new national parks are existing federal lands. And those federal lands are mostly national forests and Bureau of Land Management lands, and we are paying taxpayers subsidized to log, graze, and exploit these lands. That photo there is the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. They're logging that forest, the trees aren't worth enough to make it worth their while economically. So the taxpayers have to subsidize this logging. So we're paying to cut down our forest. Many people think it's a national park already, but if you look behind the beauty strip, you see this kind of stuff. So we need to, before they do any more damage to a lot of these areas, we need to transfer a lot of these lands over and make them national parks. And the other thing is that these agencies already have money in their budget. So these are not lands that are just like some guys back 40. This White Mountain National Forest here has millions of acres or millions of dollars in their budget. Their budgets are generally bigger than national park budgets because of all the subsidies for logging and so forth. So we would save money to designate more national parks. The other thing is they say, oh, you're going to lose jobs and it's going to ruin the economy. But the fact is, there's plenty of evidence that national parks are really good for the economy, the local economy. They provide billions of dollars in economic benefits each year. Um, and the return on taxpayer dollars that goes into managing the parks is like 10 to 1 positive. People also say, oh, if you lock these up, we can't get any timber. Don't you use toilet paper? And don't you live in a wooden house? And the fact is, only about 4%, 4 or 5% of timber in the US comes from public lands. And and only about 3% of beef comes from cattle grazed on public lands. So the fact is, these are really, and the reason it's so small is because these are not areas that really are suitable for these uses. These are areas that are marginal for the most part, or they've been overexploited in the past, so they're not producing what they would in a commercial way. So this is really inefficient and wasteful, and so protecting these areas as parks would be a big step forward, and it wouldn't have any significant impact on people's going to the supermarket or buying a house or whatever. People worry that new national parks would be loved to death, that, people think about Yosemite Valley or Cadillac Mountain in Acadia or Old Faithful. But the fact is, about 90% of national park lands are actually roadless and undeveloped backcountry that most people never go to, which is good. The trouble is that they go to places that are really popular and they cram into these areas, and that is a problem. So one way to mitigate that is to create more national parks, because if we have more places for people to go, some people are going to go, oh, I've already been to Yosemite Valley. Why don't we go to the Range of Light National Park? I heard there's a new park there. Let's go there and camp out in the wildlands. Also, National Park Service is the best agency for managing all these people, and because we get over 300 million people visit the national parks each year, but they're able to move all these people around and avoid massive damage that you could have. That there's some damage, but it's nothing compared with logging and mining and so forth. And people think, oh, well, especially now with our political, controversies and divisions and so forth, aren't political national parks just politically impossible to do? But there's no indication that's true. As I said, actually, it's in 2023 there were about 326 million visitors to national parks. That's about equivalent to the entire population of the U.S. And these are people from all over. They're people with all different political persuasions and beliefs. There's bipartisan political support. When push comes to shove, even conservative Republicans generally will do what's needed to keep parks intact. In Utah, during a government shutdown, the Utah conservative legislature appropriated money to keep their 5 national parks in Utah open because they're so important to the economy. And you see that chart there. The Pew Research Center does public opinion surveys I think it's every 2 years or so. And they ask people, what do you think of the different federal agencies and departments? And are you favorable or unfavorable? And the National Park Service is always the top 1 or 2. US Postal Service sometimes is number 1. So in 2023, National Park Service was 81% favorable. This is not liberals or left wingers. This is everybody. So national parks are just an amazingly positive brand, and we need to take advantage of that because people love parks and they will support more parks. I'm convinced of that. But the thing is though, if we're talking about 100 new parks, we're talking about tripling the size of the national park system from 84 million acres to 270 million acres. Um, the National Park Service is always, of course, like other agencies, um, strapped for needing more cash. Well, of course, if you triple the size of what they're taking care of, they would need a major boost. And in fact, to avoid political uh, entanglements, for example, they tried to ban throw away bottled water. And because of pressure from business interests, they were forced to reverse that decision. That was a political decision. So some people have said, why don't we make the Park Service an independent agency like the EPA or NASA to lessen political entanglements and also make them more independent from the ups and downs of these things. So we have been pursuing a low not quiet, but a low energy, not low energy either, sort of a gradually uplifting new national parks campaign. And it's because we don't have millions of dollars and thousands of people to do it. But we've put together these park proposals. We have a new website that's just about to go live, newparks.org. That's going to be all about new national parks. We've been talking with groups around the country who support new parks, and we're building a coalition of groups and organizations. Um, we're we're educating the public, but we need to do way more of that, and we need to activate more people. We have not yet drafted legislation, which is needed to do this. You need legislation. We know how to do it. It's been done before. Um, and to do that, to make that happen, though, you have to get political support. And with all the things going on around us, this hasn't been the best time to do that. But after the first of the year, we'll be working to approach members of Congress and state officials and so forth in key places and start to tell them what's going on and see if they'll support this idea. And, our goal is that by 2030, we will have legislation up and running, and who knows, maybe we'll even have some new national parks by then. Maybe we'll have 100 new national parks, but even if we got 25 new national parks, that would be a huge step forward. So that's what we're doing. Thanks for listening. I hope if you aren't a Restore the North Woods member, I hope you'll join because we're a membership group. We don't have tons of money, but every donation really helps and we put it to good use. You can go to our website. You can email me or even call me if you want. And there's a QR code there too that will take you to our website. So that's it. I'll be happy to answer any questions or comments.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. We have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to jump right in and start asking. First question, can national parks be where people live? If so, lots of people, only small towns, or only where there aren't people already there?
That's a really good question because it's more relevant than ever now because we don't have too many places like Yellowstone where you could just go and draw this big square and there was nobody there. But actually, there are examples where parks are interspersed with towns and people. For example, Acadia National Park is the main part's on an island, but it's in a number of different patches, and it's surrounding Bar Harbor, the town, and it's a part of it is on the mainland, and part of it is on another island. And the national parks, when you create a national park, the only land that's affected are federal ownership lands. So private lands are not affected. People's homes stay just the way they are. Towns continue to do what they did. What happens is usually the gateway towns to parks realize that they don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. So they don't want to have a junky, horribly developed town at the edge of a national park. So they usually are pretty good about trying to plan development and limit bad development and so forth. So actually, it's an inspiration to towns to do a better job of planning.
And this is from Karen. Here in Shawnee, where we're working to create the Shawnee National Park and Climate Preserve, one of the questions we often receive is about the budget and how the national park system would be able to afford a new park. I appreciate your slide addressing this. Could you expand on this, please?
Well, I've done some research on this, and if you look at the existing budget for public lands, national forests have a higher budget than national parks because they, as I mentioned, they subsidize a lot of resource extraction. And you think about it, when you go and log, you build these roads, and then the roads will erode, they'll slump, they need to be fixed, they need to be updated. That's expensive. You basically a lot of times destroy, well, you do destroy wildlife habitats, so sometimes they have to try to somehow make up for that somewhere else. So it's a very expensive thing. So these the national forests have have really big budgets. National parks have budgets too, but they're for the most part they're smaller. So if you try, so you say the Shawnee National Forest, if you flip that over to the National Park Service, all it requires is an act of Congress. Congress can do it. They just say it's tomorrow, it's going to be a national park under the National Park Service, and they could just transfer the budget over too. There's no reason not to do that. So that actually would save money because you wouldn't be spending all this money on logging and so forth. In fact, you could spend the money on protecting wildlife, on looking at climate impacts, on having better visitor facilities. That's the other thing. National forests have and BLM lands have pretty bad, if minimal visitor facilities because they spend all their money on logging and grazing and so forth. So the national parks are way better at that too.
Right. What sort of study would be needed to quantify the benefits to the local towns from the establishment of a Quabbin National Park in central Massachusetts?
Well, there are two types of, well, there are three categories of potential parks. One is I just mentioned already federal lands that are national forest or Bureau of Land Management. Another one is state-owned lands or municipal lands, which is relatively small piece, but a piece of some of the proposals. And then there are private lands. And the Quabbin, which is the largest tract of public land in southern New England, for people who don't know, there's a big reservoir in the middle of this area that supplies Boston with water, and all the forests around it are owned by the state. So it's public land, but it's not federal. So the Congress can't just say, okay, that's going to be a national park. What you have an extra layer. And so what you have to do is we need to build public support. We have to go to the state legislature and the governor and say, we'd like this area to be considered as a national park. And the Congress wouldn't just try to do it anyway. They would take their cue from the state, but also there need to be the National Park Service, when you propose a park, they do what they call a special resource study, but there are various levels of studies they can do. So they probably would do a study of the area to see if it really fits the criteria that I mentioned, for example. But the reality is, a Congress can just designate an area as a national park if the legislature goes along. And then what would happen is the state would pass legislation saying, we're going to turn this over to the federal government. That's how, for example, Shenandoah National Park was bought by the state of Virginia, and then it was turned over to the National Park Service. Big Bend National Park was mainly, believe it or not, it was bought by the state of Texas to become a national park, and then they turned it over. Um, so that's how it would work. Another way though is again, we're going to have to get out of the old thinking for national parks, and one way to do it would be to keep an area under mainly state ownership, but have a joint management plan and a joint cooperative management. For example, Boston Harbor Islands is a national recreation area. It's almost all these islands out in Boston Harbor are owned by either the city of Boston or the state. And there is a little bit of federal ownership. Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas is almost completely owned by the Nature Conservancy. And there's a little bit of federal ownership. Now, I think anything that gets us closer to protection is a good thing, but I think originally the idea was it was going to be federal, but there was political opposition because they, oh, we don't like federal lands and da, da, da. So anyway, the point is, if you want to do these things, there are precedents for doing them, and any kind of all these areas we propose, there's a precedent for doing those areas.
These are great questions. Next question in a comment. What percentage of those 326 million visitors are Americans and what percentage are foreign visitors? When I was visiting the parks regularly, there seemed to be mostly international visitors. I don't know if you would know the exact number.
I did, but that was before COVID. I have not rechecked. Actually, COVID and after COVID, the amount of the percentage of Americans has gone way up compared with foreign visitors. And most parks are there are foreign visitors, which is good. They're bringing money to these towns but it's only because I think it appears that there are lots more foreign visitors than there. I think it used to be like 20% or something like that, 25%. But it's because, they go on tours a lot of times, they could go in groups. And so you see a lot of people who are together. But the reality is a lot of parks, there are very few foreign visitors. So I don't think it's a problem, but it's, there's kind of a misperception that, I mean, Americans, there have been public opinion surveys. Almost all Americans have visited a national park at some point. A lot of the problem is, though, that, as I say, they're not close to a lot of the big urban areas. So people who don't have a lot of money, a lot of the foreign visitors we see are people who are very prosperous, can afford to come here. And so if we have more parks closer to our big cities, it's going to make it easier for American citizens who don't have a lot of money to go to the national park.
What about converting national forests to national parks? I think you did touch on this in a previous question.
I didn't get the last part of that.
What about converting national forests to national parks?
Well, most of the I believe about 60 something percent of national forest lands would become national parks under our proposal. So we basically reduced the system by more than half. And there, especially in the East, it's crazy that we're logging public. I mean, it's crazy we're logging public lands, period. It makes no sense for lots of reasons. We do it because there are special interests who want to keep doing it. And there are lots of entrenched bureaucracies, but it really, especially in the East, it's insane that we're talking about 30 by 30, as I mentioned, and we're logging forests that could be protected as a part of that. So, and again, a lot of the existing national parks were originally national forests. For actually North Cascades, which I mentioned, that was a national forest land. So there's absolutely nothing preventing that except political. The U.S. Forest Service doesn't want to lose 1 acre of their lands, but we own those lands. Those are public lands. We own them. The public can decide what we want to do with them. And I think, in the early 1900s, maybe it made sense to try to log less bad than they were doing on private lands, which was just mow everything down. That's outdated in the early 21st century. We need to talk about preserving and restoring and allowing forests to grow back and for climate and biodiversity and people. So it's totally feasible. It can totally be done. It's a political issue.
As Restore and Walden Woods Project approached Governor Healy about a Quabbin National Park. I do not know about the Walden Woods Project. I'd have to ask our executive director. But how about you, Michael?
What we've been working on in Massachusetts is state level legislation that would designate the Quabbin, among other state lands, as a reserve. And that's basically like a national park. And something like that would be necessary anyway. There'd have to be state legislation if you wanted it to become a national park. We think that it deserves to be a national park, that it's nationally significant. However, that's not the only way to protect it. If the state decided they wanted to make it a reserve and protect it like a national park, that wouldn't be a bad outcome. So the first step is to try to get political support to protect it, period. And we have been working with groups and individuals and activists all around across the state, and there's growing support for reserve protection for the Quabbin, and a lot of people are interested in a national park, but that's really sort of jumping to the next step action-wise.
Do state legislatures have an important role in nomination of lands for new national parks?
Actually, in the past, they did a lot of that. In fact, it's funny how things change in terms of perceptions. In the early 1900s and mid 1900s, legislatures, they really badly wanted new national parks because they saw it as great for the economy. It was increase the stature of the state to have a national park. So like as I mentioned, Texas in the early 1900s, they thought Big Bend out in West Texas ought to be a national park, which they were right. And so at the time, the National Park Service people said, oh, well, that's kind of dry and it's not a big mountain, not big enough mountains, and it doesn't, so we're not sure about that as a national park. So the states bought ranch lands and made a state park, not the whole thing, but a part of the current park. And then they kept working on the federal government and they passed bills urging the National Park Service to take it over, and a lot of the parks actually work that way. So it's a totally natural thing. It's kind of fallen out of favor. I'm not sure really why, but maybe in terms of again, these three crises we're facing, maybe some states will realize that that's a really great strategy for meeting their goals of protecting their lands.
How do you propose financing any land purchases, and how do you plan to incorporate forever wild / wilderness designations into the legislation?
Well, national parks now, about more than 50% of existing national parks are designated wilderness under the Wilderness Act. It's the most of any agent, far more than any of the other federal agencies. And you can do that anytime. There have been a couple examples where they designated a new national park or national parks, and in the same legislation, they had instant wilderness designation for roadless areas that meet the qualifications. The California Desert Act, for example, that's what they did when they designated national parks there. So there's nothing preventing a bill from saying this area is going to be a national park, and then within this park, these areas are going to be designated as wilderness under the Wilderness Act. That's totally feasible. And that's what we support. I mean, that's what we ought to do.
I'm curious about what some of the big conservation environmental organizations think about your proposal. Are they with you on this?
Well, that's a complicated question. I used to work for the Wilderness Society back in the day, and I know how they work, the big organizations. And Sierra Club is a little different because it has its individual chapters. And interestingly enough, Sierra Club has been the most, depending on where you are, they've been the most interested in this idea. Other groups are not necessarily opposing new national parks. They generally they tend to not jump on board something until it looks like it's really the train's moving down the tracks. And I mean, it makes some sense. They've got a lot of things going on, and so it's easier to sort of parse out what's going on. But anyway, we don't look to them to lead the charge on this, but that doesn't mean we see them as opponents in the long run. We think that they will support what people want to do. They just have to decide what their priorities are.
What new national parks would you like to see in New England and beyond?
In New England, well, we're proposing 10 in New England. They're on our map. There's so many areas, 100 areas, I can't always keep track, but we're talking about a number of areas, including the Maine Woods and the down east Maine and the Quabbin, as we mentioned, the Berkshires, and the last Green Valley, which is an area that overlaps Connecticut and Rhode Island, and the White and Green Mountain National Forests, and expanding Cape Cod National Seashore, and there probably are a couple I'm not remembering. But anyway, New England has, people sort of assume there's not any potential in New England for something like that, but actually there's a lot of potential. New England has large expanses of forest that have grown back after being cut. And they've been growing back for 100 years or more in a lot of places. So you really have a lot of opportunities in the states have been buying up land over time. There are land trusts that have been buying a lot of land. So there's a lot of open space to work with. And plus, this is the most densely populated part of the country. So there's a real need for things like national parks.
All right, looks like we have just two more questions.
Yeah.
What is the need to subsidize logging and grazing and all that? This makes no sense to me.
Well, I agree. What it is it started out that they logged public land that was old growth forest, and they actually made money a lot in the Pacific Northwest. They made a lot of money, brought a lot of money into the treasury from that. But now all the most valuable stuff has pretty much been cut. And so, but you've got this entrenched bureaucracy. You've got at least foresters who went to forestry school who believe that what you need to do with forests is let them grow long enough so they're ready to cut. And then you cut them. And then they grow back. And then you cut them again. And a lot of places you create a plantation, which is horrible ecologically, but that's what they're doing in a lot of places. So now they've got this bureaucracy. You got these thousands and thousands of people working for these agencies, and their job is to keep doing this. And so they're not going to change willingly, even as long as they can keep getting money. And the reason that the subsidies happen from a political standpoint, Congress continues to subsidize because it creates jobs. It's a really bad way to create jobs. It's really inefficient, and we're trashing our forests. But some member of Congress in his district, he's got some town that has a bunch of loggers living there. So to him, that's oh, I'm bringing home the bacon. And so some people think that we need to try to change the way these agencies operate. I think that's not going to happen. I've been following this for 30 plus years, and people have said that all along, and there's been no improvement. In fact, I'd say it's worse. So that's why the other way to approach it is to say, we're going to look at the areas that we can agree ought to be protected. And whether you guys want to or not in these agencies, that's tough. you work for us. Those are our lands, and we're going to transfer them to a different agency. And and we choose to spend our money on protection and recreation and wildlife rather than cutting down trees and grazing cattle that belong in the British Isles on desert, which is what we're doing. It's nuts. So anyway,
There's some in the chat, so I'm going to try to get through just two more. What was the process for creating the Cape Cod National Seashore?
the original seashore, um, that was actually President Kennedy, who spent lots of time on the Cape, was convinced by his Secretary of the Interior that we need more seashores, more shorelines protected because there were hardly any at the time. This was in the late 1950s. And John F. Kennedy said, Cape Cod's really beautiful. I love Cape Cod. And Secretary Udall said, well, let's create a new designation of national seashore and let's find a way to protect it. And so that's where it started. And there was opposition, just like all national parks, there's always opposition. But I can guarantee you there aren't very many people on Cape Cod who regret that they created Cape Cod National Seashore. And that's how it is with all the parks. So it was very far-sighted to, at that time, realize that need to happen.
Right, last question. I think it's a good one to end on. What do you think the biggest challenge with creating new national parks is?
I think the biggest challenge is basically to get people to think big and realize that we really can still do big things. People use the term moonshot for some big projects. Well, that's really what this is. This is a moonshot level thing where we need all people all across the country to be involved. I can't sit here and do it, and no individual groups can do it, but we could create a coalition across the country. If you're talking about creating a new national park in each state, so everybody has a stake. Everybody would benefit from this. And I think the main challenge is just to build, to get enough public awareness and support and recognition that this really could happen. And in fact, it's really important that it does happen. And I think it's very possible. It's just we're racing against time here in terms of all these forces of climate and biodiversity and so forth. So we don't have a lot of time to fool around. So in the old days, they'd say, yeah, let's work on, maybe in a few years, we'll create a park here or a park there. And that's, that was fine then. Now we need to really think big. And I think I think it's possible, but it's a challenge to get over that hurdle.
All right, well, I'm going to wrap it up there right on time. Thank you so much, Michael. This was an awesome presentation and a really lively Q&A. So thanks
Thanks.
everyone for your questions at home. Just one more note, the Walden Woods Project and Restore the North Woods have been doing our virtual events for free and our in-person events as well. We will continue to do so. If anyone wants or can make a donation to either, we would be grateful, or to both. But mostly thank you for continuing to show up, and we look forward to more events with you in the future. I'll just paste these links into the chat. And with that, I'll say check out both of our websites for more events. This is the last one we have for the Walden Woods Project for the year, but
and so just a special thanks to the Walden Woods Project and you, Sarah and Kathy, and everyone for doing these. This is really, you're really doing a service because you have a lot of important issues that you're covering. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, thanks for joining us for a few this year. They've been fun and well attended, which is always a good thing. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Good night.
Take care.